With the coalition sucking all the oxygen out of the news cycle lately, there's been a bunch of stuff that I've wanted to look at, but I've always found myself distracted. Every time I think the coalition have hit rock bottom, they seem to have found a new and creative way to sink even further. But let's be honest here, the biggest beneficiary of that has been the Labor Party, who have been able to just coast along as the coalition implode. So on that note, let's talk about the government's 5% deposit scheme. I think first up, we need to be honest about what the 5% deposit scheme actually is. It's a rebranded and expanded version of Scott Morrison's Home Guarantee Scheme, first introduced in 2020.
We want to help make the dreams of first home buyers a reality. So we have decided to go further at this election and pledge to adopt a scheme similar to what's been running by our Kiwi cousins in New Zealand for many years now. Our new first home loan deposit scheme, I announced today, will enable first homeowners to buy their home with a deposit of down to 5%. This will make a big difference.
If you're not familiar with it, the scheme, according to the government, was designed to help get people into home ownership sooner by allowing eligible applicants to purchase a home with a minimum deposit of 5%, with the Australian government then stepping in to provide a guarantee to the participating lender for the difference between the buyer's deposit and a 20% deposit. This government guarantee means the buyer avoids having to pay lender's mortgage insurance. That's it. The elbow version, which came into effect from the 1st of October 2025, expanded the 5% deposit scheme, opening it up to all first home buyers, removing income caps and caps on the number of applications. They also lifted property price caps to be in line with current average house prices. Now, whether you view the elbow version of the scheme as better or worse than the ScoMo edition probably depends on what side of the fence you sit on, but I have to say that the decision to remove income caps was an interesting one. In my view, I think that removing the income cap was a bit of a silly move, because in doing so the government's really just opened up the scheme to people that were likely already going to be able to buy a home anyway, and don't really need the government's help to get there. And to be fair, that seems to be a view echoed by those like the Grattan Institute as well.
The scheme was already available really to anyone that was struggling to be able to buy a home. So those that can now access the scheme, it's really allowing them to buy with a 5% deposit rather than a 20% deposit when they're on above average incomes buying an above average priced home.
So you think that's been worthwhile?
No, that's a backward step really. I think the scheme as it was probably as generous as it ever needed to be. And this does push prices up while giving support to those that really are always going to be able to buy a home.
The important thing to remember here is that the government's guarantee is just removing the need for lenders' mortgage insurance. It's not actually reducing the size of the required loan. While there is the upfront savings that comes from avoiding the need to pay mortgage lenders' insurance, the catch here is that since you're only stumping up a 5% deposit instead of a 20% deposit, you're going to be borrowing a lot more money from the bank. A bigger loan means you stand to pay more interest over the life of that loan. Your monthly repayments will be higher, and the total amount of interest you pay to the bank will be greater than if you had saved the full 20% deposit. Really, that's why you can view this whole thing as a trade-off. As a first home buyer, there are probably a whole heap of pros and cons you'd need to weigh up. Whether this program's good for you or not, it depends. Your mileage may vary. It's probably worth seeking professional financial advice and all that sort of stuff. To give you an idea of how it may work, let's take a look at a rough example. Let's say you're in Melbourne and you purchase a home for $950,000. In both scenarios I'll use for this example, assume you're taking out a 30-year loan at an interest rate of 6% per annum. Under the normal scenario, you'd need a 20% deposit in order to take out a loan, without the need for lender's mortgage insurance. 20% on $950,000 is $190,000. This leaves you with $760,000 to pay back on your loan. Over 30 years, your monthly loan repayments come in at just over $4,500 a month. So your total repayments over 30 years total $1.636 million, meaning the total interest you've paid over the life of that loan is almost $877,000. Hefty. Under the 5% deposit scheme though, you'd only need to scrape together a deposit of $47,500, leaving you with a loan of just over $900,000. Over a 30-year term, your monthly repayments come in at just over $5,400 per month, which is around $900 a month more than if you'd bought under the 20% deposit scenario. Over the life of the 30-year loan, your total repayments will be $1.947 million. The total interest you'd pay over that period is just over $1 million. So, under the 5% deposit scenario, you'd expect to incur $168,540 more in total interest over the 30-year term, purely due to the fact that you need to borrow more by virtue of the lower deposit. On the flip side though, you avoid paying rent for however long it would take you to bridge the gap between the 5% and 20% deposit. But yeah, like I said, it's a trade-off. Pros and cons. For people that this will genuinely help, it's fantastic. But this thing does have a touch of buyer beware about it, as you can see how it might lead people to take on more debt than they can reasonably handle, and leave them pretty vulnerable to any interest rate rises among other things. So is the 5% deposit scheme good policy? Well, looking at the price caps that are in place and the current property market, I reckon there's a decent chance that this may just end up throwing a whole heap of people into immediate mortgage stress. For many people struggling to get into the housing market, one of the biggest hurdles is having the ability to service the debt in the first place. This scheme won't help with that. I guess the reality is that average income earners would find it near impossible to meet the repayments required for homes toward the top end of the price caps. This is really vibes-based policy. It sounds nice, might legitimately help a very small number of people, but that's about it. What it does do is place more pressure on the lower end of the property market without doing anything to help on the supply side. Like the HAF, the 5% deposit scheme might sound nice, and it gives Labor something to point to whenever they're pushed on housing, but that's about it. If you need any evidence to show that this is just vibes-based policy, then consider this fact. The government didn't even bother to ask for modelling on the impact it would have on the housing market until a couple of months after it had already been announced.
Okay, so let me just get this right. So the Minister's Office asks the Treasury for modelling before the policy was announced?
We were asked for modelling in late July 2025.
July this year. This was announced in May, and so you asked for your expert advice on price impacts in July.
Yes.
You probably don't need to be a genius to recognise that this policy was going to lead to an increase in property prices. This policy, by its very nature, artificially boosts demand without doing anything to boost supply, and specifically boosts demand at the lower end of the market. Treasury and the government have pointed to modelling that suggests it would only have a very modest impact on housing prices. But that raised a few eyebrows as well as a few questions.
The model itself is a more complicated thing in terms of a range of calculations that are done. So Treasury provided a summary of the results of that exercise.
Did you do a range of scenarios, or did you just spit out one outcome?
So what we did with the model is we took the estimates of the impact of the scheme in terms of what we thought the scheme would do in terms of increasing the number of people who'd be entering the market. And what we modelled was the effect of that increased demand on dwelling prices.
Did you run a variety of assumptions across your model about the impact on demand?
So, in terms of arriving at the assumption, I can speculate around general commentary around developing assumptions.
Did you include in your model any assumptions about supply? Or what were the assumptions you included about supply?
So I think I'd need to take that on notice.
Okay. Could you provide us with the full description of the model and the way it was conducted? I'm right at the edges of my knowledge as well in these matters, but it surprises me that there weren't different scenarios run, and I am curious about other assumptions.
I just wanted to clarify, Dr. Hunter, how many people did you say, how many more people will be buying a home under the new scheme?
So we estimate that 3,100 first home buyer households in the first year who would not have purchased otherwise.
When it comes to modelling, the quality of the output is super dependent on the inputs and the assumptions going in. And this is where it all gets a little bit sketchy from the government, as they refuse to release the modelling behind their 0.5% price increase over 6 years claim. And all these questions about the modelling, they're more than valid given what we've seen after the first couple of months of the scheme.
Home values are rising at their fastest pace in 2 years. New figures show a 1.1% jump last month has pushed the annual growth rate above 6%. Housing researcher Cotality says the government's expanded deposit guarantee scheme has intensified competition for more affordable properties, and the rise in house prices has already cancelled out the extra borrowing power from lower interest rates.
Whilst I don't want to fall into the correlation doesn't equal causation trap, in this case it's kind of hard not to start drawing the conclusion that this policy will have had a greater impact on property prices, particularly on property within the price caps, than the government thought. Cotality, formerly CoreLogic, have described the home value increase in October as unusually strong, although they also stress it's hard to draw a direct link. Data has shown, though, that the values of properties below the new Home Guarantee Scheme price caps have risen at faster rates than those above the caps in many regions. It's early days, but intuitively this makes sense. The government have released figures, though, that show that almost 6,000 first home buyers used the scheme in October 2025, which accounted for around 1 in 10 sales. How many of those first home buyers jumped into the market purely as a result of this scheme? At this stage we don't really know, but it would be those buyers that have helped push up property prices. There was also the reported property rush and panic buying ahead of the expansion of the program. The Insurance Council of Australia, which it should be said does have some skin in the game as a result of the government covering the mortgage lenders insurance, commissioned some analysis by Lateral Economics. They estimated that the expansion will cause house prices to rise by up to 10% in the first year in the housing market of greatest interest for most first home buyers by bringing forward existing demand in Australia's already stressed housing market. They also concluded that between 3,500 and 6,500 lower income prospective home buyers, who would benefit most from the scheme, will be priced out of the market in the first year of the expanded scheme alone. Ultimately, the problem I have with the 5% deposit scheme is similar to one of the main issues I had with the HAF. It's a feel-good vibe-based policy that, at its core, will do very little to shift the dial on the housing crisis. And that's the problem with a lot of the government's housing policy. It's all little bits and pieces type stuff that sounds nice, often has a nice dollar figure attached, and gives the impression the government are taking significant action, and it gives them something to point to. But so long as the government's policy settings allow for housing to remain a speculative asset, as long as the government's policy settings continue to position housing as a long-term investment, a tax-effective way for high-income earners to park some of their money, then the housing crisis is not going to be solved anytime soon. If nothing else, the 5% deposit scheme gives Claire O'Neill something to create TikToks about, and the government something to hide behind while maintaining the status quo that led to the housing crisis in the first place.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.